Let me start with a quote, which you may know from George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable person. And I love that quote because I think that's what marks out a great leader, is they are unreasonable. Leadership. I want to talk about the kind of leadership that changes things, because that's really what we're looking at over these days. But let me start by talking about a failure of leadership. Then I want to talk briefly about a model of leadership. Then I want to apply it in three areas. So if you want a good definition of leadership, I think as much as anything it's this, is leaders are people who see and they take responsibility. See, I think we could do a whole other talk around the issue of seeing. I think we choose not to see many, many things because they're too big and too painful and impossible. But I think leaders allow themselves to see the enormity and the impossibility and take responsibility. So I want to talk this morning about the kind of leadership that does engage. What kind of leadership writes a different story? And just to explain where I come from myself on this, so I work with the global corporates in terms of leadership development, both in the private and the public sector, but I literally work on leadership development with the poorest of the poor. And that's where I was week before last. I was literally sitting with the traders who are working out how do I get from my 6 tomatoes and my 1 chicken to actually do something to get my family so that we can afford to pay our hospital bills and put food on the table. So I live in both sides of this world, and the executive coach probably captures one bit of it, and emerging leaders captures something of the other bit. So what I want to do to start with is give you my model of leadership, and that sounds a little bit grand to say that. I'll explain why. Then I want to talk about what it means to recover the heart of leadership. Then I want to talk about recovering the story of leadership, and then I want to talk about recovering eldership. But what I was saying is, well, what if there's something beyond leadership? If there's something beyond leadership, you see, then what happens is that you make leadership the glass ceiling. If there's something beyond leadership and we don't know what it is, then actually the effect that it will have is to make our leadership smaller, diminished. And what I uncovered from reading, from travel, from my own background, was actually to come back to the notion of eldership. Actually, there is something that lies beyond leadership, and it's called eldership. And some of you from your backgrounds and your cultures will say, yippee, you finally arrived. We've known this for generations. And it's true. It's true. A friend of mine, Peter Hawkins, was on a plane. The guy next to him was working with Nelson Mandela when coming to the end of their term of government. So the guy next to Peter Hawkins, they're chatting, and Peter Hawkins say, you know, how's it going? He said, well, I'm just about to retire. So Peter Hawkins says, that's great. You know, you've had a phenomenal, like the last 10, 20 years, and amazing what you've done and all the rest of it. You must be so relieved that you're coming to the end and you can go home and sit down and have a sleep and play with the grandkids. And the guy turns to him and says, you don't understand my culture. He said, I now become an elder. I now become an elder. He said, my job is now to hold the leadership to account. My job is to say to the new leadership of the country, so why are you doing that? So why are you really doing that? So why are you really, really doing that? So why are you really, really, really doing that? See, that's what elders do. An elder is someone who has the wisdom of years, and I'm not going to put an age on it, but they have wisdom and an independence of leadership. See, most people, even with the wisdom of years in our organizations, are on the payroll. Even non-executive board members are on the payroll in some way or other. Elders are on nobody's payroll. Now, the interesting thing was I've been researching this book and actually written the whole first abstracts and drafts of it and all the rest of it. And then Richard Branson went to visit Nelson Mandela and said, look, we've got all these huge issues in the world, the big untractable issues of our generation. What would we do? And Nelson Mandela said, well, what we would do in our culture is we would bring these issues to the elders So they then said, well, what would it be to have a group of global elders? And we now have the global elders. If you go on globalelders.org, I think it is, or whatever. So we have this group of global elders who bring an independence. They're not in anyone's pocket. They are not paid to be an elder. They are invited in to bring their wisdom and their perspective and ask questions that go beyond their own lifetime. And I think it's an interesting question, and maybe a slightly risky one to ask. If the elders had been brought into this country to challenge the government about going to war in Iraq, what would the result be? Because what the elders say is, why are you doing this? Why are you really, really doing this? And they don't mind the politicians being upset with them because they're independent. You can't fire an elder. But what they do is they bring independent wisdom and leadership into a situation and hold leaders to account on the bigger questions that they should be asking. And this is so vital to climate change. We need elders.